In a galaxy ruled by centuries of tradition, a princess admired by all is rejected by her own kind until one fearless human dares to challenge the impossible, and nothing in the universe will ever be the same. The palace of Solera stretched like a constellation, frozen in crystal, corridors twisting, with impossible angles that bent light and shadow into fractals of silver and violet. The floors, smooth and reflective, were scattered with faint pulses of energy that marked the path of those walking, a gentle hum accompanying every step. Princess Lee moved through this maze with the grace of one born to it, though even her long, elegant ears, curving backward in a subtle arch, couldn't shield her from the eyes of courtiers who looked upon her with polite awe and subtle avoidance. She had been taught that elegance, diplomacy, and intellect were the crown jewels of any Solaran woman, yet in practice they seemed to function like a neon sign, pointing at her, announcing, admirable but undesirable. The day had begun like any other, with a morning of ceremonial greetings where she had exchanged bows and polite words with a line of alien dignitaries who might have been robots, if not for the way they blinked in just the wrong rhythm and sniffed each other's hand holsters at intervals. Each one offered excuses about why marriage was impossible, contracts to renegotiate, newly discovered planetary alignments, a sudden allergic reaction to starlight, excuses that made her want to smile and scream simultaneously. She kept her lips pressed together in polite silence, though her thoughts were far less measured. Next time I'll bring a robot to negotiate my suitors, she mused inwardly, watching one dignitary trip over a gravity adjustment panel and narrowly avoid colliding with a floating vase of luminescent orchids. Humor had become her refuge, a secret weapon in a palace where decorum was enforced with the rigidity of graviton beams. She chuckled quietly to herself, imagining a grand parade of dignitaries slipping and sliding through corridors while she sat atop a hovering chair, sipping a beverage that shimmered with micrometeorite ice. Even the palace cat, a creature with fur like liquid silver and nanotech-imbued eyes, seemed to sense her mood, curling around her ankles and purring a frequency only audible to those with acute neural enhancers. Lyra bent down to scratch its ears, and it responded with a gleeful chirp that sounded suspiciously like laughter. One of us has a sense of humor, she murmured. It was in the middle of a particularly tedious round of ceremonial bows that news arrived of a human visiting a nearby colony, a species so unpredictable that even the most adventurous Solaran diplomats avoided it. Humans, with their curious lack of concern for protocol and strange, often clumsy inventiveness, were an anomaly. The idea that one might show up in Solera with the audacity to approach the royal court was both thrilling and alarming. Lyra's ears twitched in anticipation. Perhaps, finally, someone would shake the palace out of its stifling routine. Perhaps, finally, someone might see her not as a prize to be won or avoided, but as a person. Meanwhile, the human Ellis, according to the limited reports, was arriving aboard a ship that looked more like a patchwork quilt of metal and cargo crates than a vessel capable of interstellar diplomacy. Its engines sputtered a cheerful, rebellious pattern as it approached the orbit of Solera, trailing colorful exhaust that tinted the nebula with streaks of green and orange. Inside, Ellis was cursing under his breath at a navigation panel that had developed a minor sentience and seemed intent on sending him in loops around the star system. No, I don't care if it wants to visit the asteroid belt again. Just get me to the palace in one piece, he muttered, pressing buttons with a mix of desperation and hope. His hair, perpetually windsoiled, even in zero gravity, fell into his eyes as he accidentally knocked over a cup of biofuel that hissed and evaporated in a tiny rainbow cloud. Perfect, he said, grinning wryly. Nothing says diplomatic finesse like a rainbow of evaporating biofuel. The moment he stepped onto Solera, chaos followed with an almost comical precision. Gravity panels misaligned under his boots, causing him to perform an impromptu shuffle that looked like a cross between dancing and flailing, and a small delivery robot, apparently programmed to assist him, mistook his sleeve for a docking bay and latched on, spraying glitter everywhere. Courtiers gasped, some clutched their anti-gravity canes, a few muttered about the audacity of a human daring to enter the palace unannounced, while others simply stifled laughter, curious to see what would happen next. Lyra, watching from the grand observation balcony, stifled a giggle behind a hand of pale, luminescent skin. This might actually be entertaining, she thought. Ella's, oblivious to the scandalized stares, continued to navigate the palace with the confidence of someone who had survived multiple near-death encounters. On far stranger worlds, he tripped over a decorative gravestone, part of the palace's extensive art collection, celebrating forgotten heroes of Solera, apologized to it, and then waved cheerfully at an older court official who seemed scandalized that a human would address him directly. You look like you could use a cup of coffee, or whatever your species drinks, he said. The official sputtered. The cat chirped again, as if applauding his bravery. When he finally encountered Lyra, it was not in the formal audience chamber, but in a quiet corridor lined with windows, revealing the swirling nebula beyond. She stood poised, her ears angled slightly backward in a gesture that was both curiosity and caution. He bowed awkwardly, his uniform slightly singed from the earlier biofuel incident, and offered a smile that was equal parts apology and daring. Princess, he said, I've heard a lot about you, mostly whispers about how terrifying and perfect you are, which frankly made me curious. Lyra blinked. She had never encountered someone so blatantly honest, or so untroubled by the pomp and circumstance of her world. Their initial conversation was a collision of culture. She spoke carefully, choosing words that adhered to courtly protocols, while he answered with humor, often misinterpreting her formalities as invitations to joke. At one point he commented on the ceiling lights, suggesting they resembled interstellar disco balls, prompting her to suppress a laugh so sharp it made the cat jump. For the first time in years, the corridors felt alive, not merely a stage for rejection or formalities. The palace, with its refracting lights and whispering walls, seemed to acknowledge the novelty, as if even the architecture leaned forward to watch. Over the following days, Ella's explored the palace with an insistent curiosity that amused and exasperated the staff in equal measure. He asked questions no Solarin had dared to ask aloud, touched objects without permission, and occasionally knocked over priceless faces in ways that seemed almost intentional, accompanied by embarrassed but genuine apologies. Lyra began to appreciate the unfiltered view of her world he offered, seeing absurdities and contradictions. She had long accepted with silent frustration. Their banter became a daily ritual, a mixture of teasing, exasperation, and humor, so light that it lifted the oppressive weight of expectation from her shoulders. One evening in the garden of floating Flora, they found themselves watching twin moons orbit in a delicate dance. Across the violet sky, Ella's attempted to describe Earth constellations, though he admitted that most humans had never seen the solar and moons before. Lyra laughed, a sound that seemed to scatter starlight itself, and corrected him with a teasing, "I think you're inventing stories now." He grinned, shrugging. "Better stories than your suitors ever offered." She blinked momentarily, speechless, realizing that for the first time someone wasn't measuring her worth by protocol or custom, but simply appreciating her presence. By the time the week ended, the palace was buzzing with whispered rumors. Alien suitors had retreated further, either intimidated or outraged by the humans' audacity. The princess, who had once moved through corridors like a solitary comet, now walked with a new energy, her ears twitching at every sound and flicking toward the human with growing interest. And while chaos still trailed Ella's like an orbiting comet, glittered floors, mishandled gravitation panels, and occasional singed decorations, his humor and courage began to form a pattern that promised something entirely new. Not just admiration, but a connection that could challenge centuries of tradition. And in the quiet moments as they shared stories of distant worlds and laughed at the ridiculousness of palace etiquette, Lyra realized that perhaps the arrival of one human, awkward, fearless, and endlessly amusing, was the first spark capable of igniting change across a universe that had long refused to bend. The morning sunlight spilled through the transparent domes of Solera's palace, like molten starlight, refracting into delicate ribbons of color that twisted lazily across the polished floors. Princess Lyra stood at the edge of the upper balcony, her long ears angled slightly forward as she watched Ella's maneuver a small hover cart down the corridor below. He was carrying what looked like a case of interstellar gadgets, some of which clinked and warred in protest, as though refusing to obey their master. She tilted her head, the faint curve of amusement playing on her lips, and allowed herself the rare indulgence of observing him without the pretense of diplomacy. Even in messy, chaotic way, there was a rhythm to his movements, a certain irrepressible charm that drew attention despite, or perhaps because of, the trails of minor calamity that followed him. Ella's paused mid-step, holding up a device that resembled a miniature star projector, except it was leaking smoke from one corner. "I swear it worked on Beetlejuice," he muttered, turning it this way and that as if the machine might be shy and needed encouragement. One of the hovering servants, a floating orb with polite blinking lights, zipped closer to inspect the device, its sensors beeping in what sounded suspiciously like disapproval. Ella's waved it off, gesturing with exaggerated flair, and Lyra felt the corners of her mouth twitch with amusement. "You could try, I don't know, turning it off and on again," she suggested, voice carefully measured yet tinged with playful sarcasm. He looked up, eyes wide, clearly considering her suggestion as profound wisdom rather than mere jest. "Ah, a brilliant idea from the princess herself," he declared, bowing awkwardly mid-step and nearly tipping the card over. A small explosion of sparks from The device sent a puff of smoke upward, which he waved with a glove, looking heroic in a way that was only slightly ridiculous. Lyra bit back a laugh, her ears flicking in amusement. She had grown accustomed to witnessing courtly absurdities, but this was new. The human treated the palace itself as a playground rather than a gauntlet of etiquette. Over the next several days, Ellis continued to traverse Solera with reckless curiosity. He attended formal receptions, stumbling through anti-gravity dances that left both human and alien observers dizzy, and some survived multiple attempts at ceremonial dueling practice, which were designed to intimidate or impress alien nobles. The princess followed these escapades with growing interest, noting how his humor and resourcefulness seemed to expose the underlying absurdities of her rigid world. One evening during a dinner, under the floating bioluminescent canopies, he accidentally knocked over a tray of glowing delicacies. Instead of scandal, he seized a hovering, jellyfish-like appetizer, twirled it between his fingers, and announced, "Behold, I have tamed the domestic fauna of Solera." The court murmured, unsure whether to scold or applaud, while Lyra's restrained giggle carried across the table, unnoticed by most but felt by him as if it were a secret signal. The palace cat, now a regular observer of their antics, perched atop a hovering pillar, tail flicking in rhythm with their laughter. It chirped, occasionally, a sound that somehow punctuated the absurdity of court life and reminded Lyra that humor was not forbidden. With Ilya's small disasters became opportunities for amusement and shared experience rather than embarrassment or humiliation. She began to see the man not as an interloper, but as a companion capable of navigating her world with sincerity and courage, qualities that had been conspicuously absent in all previous suitors. It was during a mid-afternoon walk through the hanging gardens that their bond deepened. The gardens were suspended in gravity-daying rings, where luminous plants drifted lazily. Suspended orbits and streams of water fell upward in shimmering arcs. Ella's examining a particularly iridescent flower that appeared to hum in resonance with the nebula outside, turned to her with a mock-serious expression. "So, these are your suitors' favorite hideouts?" "Yes, I must say, if alien nobles think hovering gardens are impressive, they have clearly never tried Earth's rainforests or our backyard sprinkler system," he said, gesturing at a hovering mist of dew that refracted the sunlight in dazzling patterns. Lyra raised an eyebrow but could not hide the laugh that escaped her. The combination of audacity and irreverence struck her as entirely refreshing. Their conversations became a daily ritual. She would ask questions of courtly importance: which trade routes were most lucrative, how interplanetary alliances were shifting, what historical precedents justified the most obscure customs. He would respond with humor, often deliberately misunderstanding, which forced her to laugh even when she meant to remain serious. Once, when asked about diplomatic strategy, he leaned on a railing, gesturing wildly with one arm, while the other held a steaming cup of alien tea. Step 1, confuse them with bold gestures. Step 2, confuse them further by accidentally setting off ornamental defense drones. Step 3, profit morally and socially. Lyra and LT Unc and GT's laughter, once rare and controlled, now rang freely through the corridors, echoing in harmony with the hum of the palace. One day a more serious test arrived. a visiting delegation from a distant system arrived to discuss the possibility of marrying the princess, a situation that had caused previous suitors to either panic or invent allergies. Lyra watched as Ellis, rather than hiding or deferring, introduced himself to each member with casual confidence, asking questions about their ships, their home worlds, and the most absurd customs they practiced. One dignitary, clearly flustered by his directness, nearly dropped a ceremonial orb. Another whispered complaints about the impropriety of interacting with a human. Ella's oblivious waved cheerfully. "I only break protocol for fun," he said, "and apparently for exceptional royalty." The delegation, though initially appalled, found themselves reluctantly charmed by his audacity. Lyra could not help but smile, noting how different courage paired with humor could be from cold compliance. Later that evening, Lyra invited Ellis to accompany her to the observation deck, a circular platform suspended outside the palace dome where the swirling nebula painted the sky in living colors. They stood side by side, looking out at the stars, and for a moment the palace and its formalities seemed distant, irrelevant. Elias, ever the human, made a joke about the constellations, suggesting that the nebula looked like a cosmic pancake breakfast, complete with syrup-colored gases and floating blueberry stars. Lyra laughed openly, her ears twitching with genuine amusement. "You have no sense of scale," she teased. "Those are light years across." "Exactly," he said, bowing theatrically, "which is why it's the perfect metaphor for your court. Vast, complicated, slightly absurd, and entirely beautiful." It was in that moment that she realized the impact he had on her world. With each shared joke, each accidental mishap, he chipped away at the invisible walls of tradition and expectation, replacing them with laughter, trust in the thrill of unpredictability. Even the court seemed to shift subtly in response as whispers of the humans' antics spread. Some alien officials remained scandalized, some were quietly impressed, and a few secretly began to envy the ease with which he navigated a world that had long seemed designed to intimidate and exclude. The following days continued this delicate dance between humor and diplomacy. Ellis insisted on attending lessons in solar and history, which he interpreted in comically literal ways, reenacting ancient battles with makeshift laser swords and making sound effects that had the palace guards blushing. Lyra, initially mortified, found herself secretly enjoying the performances, offering gentle corrections while secretly admiring his courage to flout decorum. Their shared amusement became a private language, subtle enough to amuse them without immediately scandalizing the court. Even mundane palace chores became sources of comedy while assisting with anti-gravity laundry, an endeavor that often ended in floating garments and tangled robes. Ellis accidentally caused a minor zero-gravity tornado that sent a line of formal attire spinning through the hallways. Lyra chased after the garments, laughing so freely that she nearly lost her balance on a hovering platform. The cat, ever observant, darted after the flying robes with evident glee. "At this rate," Lyra said, brushing a silver sleeve off her head, "you might single-handedly start a rebellion among my advisors just by existing." By the end of the week, something undeniable had formed between them, a bond that combined trust, laughter, and a shared delight in breaking the oppressive seriousness of Court life. Lyra and LT Unc and GT's ears twitched. More frequently at his presence, subtle shifts in posture signaling attention and curiosity rather than formal restraint. Ella's, for his part, navigated the palace with a mix of bravado and humility, aware that he was an anomaly, but embracing it fully, his humor softening the rigidity of centuries old tradition. One evening as they prepared to leave the gardens, a minor misadventure with a hovering water fountain resulted in Ilya's being drenched head to toe, his hair plastered comically to his face. Lyra couldn't stop laughing. You really have a talent for disaster, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. He grinned, water dripping from his ears, and replied, and you have a talent for enjoying it. In the quiet aftermath, as they stood side by side, watching the nebula's colors swirl and pulse, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, she thought, the universe was larger and stranger than her traditions allowed, and perhaps courage, humor, and sincerity, embodied in one reckless human, could illuminate paths that propriety and fear had long obscured. And so, amidst the glittering corridors, floating gardens, and nebulous skies, the princess and the human walked together, laughter echoing into the night, their bond growing unpredictable and bold like a new star emerging in the galaxy's endless expanse. The observation deck hovered silently above Solera, suspended by graviton anchors that shimmered faintly against the swirling colors of the nebula below. Princess Lyra stood near the edge, her long ears tilted slightly back, catching the faint hum of the palace machinery and the soft pulse of the stars. She had spent the past weeks navigating chaos, curiosity, and companionship, and now, as the sun of her star system caught the edges of the deck in liquid gold, she felt the peculiar calm that came before something decisive. Ella's, as always, arrived with a small mishap, a hover drone trailing a tangle of streamers, the result of a failed attempt to deliver a gift of delicately patterned flowers. I call it modern art, he said, grinning, holding the bouquet upside down so the petals gently graze the floor. Lyra blinked at him, a soft laugh escaping despite the tension she didn't fully acknowledge. Somehow he made even the most formal occasions feel absurdly human and wonderfully alive. The court had gathered below in the grand hall, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and scandalized fascination. Some held glowing beverages in midair, trembling as though gravity itself feared the upcoming event. Alien nobles whispered in clusters, ears twitching in disbelief. It was unheard of, even in Solera's long history, for someone outside the royal species to openly challenge centuries of tradition, and even more so to publicly address the princess. But Lyra's confidence, tempered by the weeks of observing Ilya's navigate her world with humor and bravery, steadied her resolve. She had changed in subtle but profound ways. Patience replaced irritation, laughter replaced frustration, and curiosity replaced dread. The rigidity that had defined her life was beginning to bend. In the presence of audacity and sincerity, Ella's climbed the spiral staircase with an exaggerated flourish, holding a small ceremonial device that resembled a holographic projector, though one could not be entirely sure of its intended function. The hover drone trailed erratically behind him, occasionally spraying glitter and sparks that harmlessly bounced off the observation deck shield. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished Anti-gravity guardians, he called voice. Carrying across the courtyard below, I come not to conquer, nor to negotiate taxes, nor to rearrange furniture. Well, not entirely, I come to speak plainly, and if possible impress with heroic flair. A ripple of muttered gasps spread through the alien nobles, many of whom had never witnessed such audacity. Lyra and Lt and GT, ears twitched in amusement. A small smile playing on her lips, he activated the projector, and a brilliant holographic display of the nebula unfolded around them, miniature stars spinning in iridescent rings, shimmering gas clouds forming patterns that were half comet, half cosmic tapestry. Princess Lyra, he began, his voice steady despite the spectacle. In your world, they tell stories about bravery, honor, and custom. They have built walls to keep you admired but unapproachable, feared but respected, and yet here I stand, a human, a creature of chaos and curiosity, utterly unfit for formal approval, and yet utterly compelled to speak the truth. Lyra felt her ears twitch involuntarily. She had heard many words in her life, many that were calculated, precise, and cautious. These were not those words. These were bold, unpolished, and entirely honest. Your suitors, as I understand, have feared you, admired you, and rejected the possibility of partnership, he continued, gesturing to the court below. They worried about tradition, about appearances, about cosmic alignments, and trivial inconveniences, but I am not bound by your fears, nor do I wish to be. I come with my own recklessness, my own misadventures, and my own sincerity. And I ask no, I declare that I wish to stand with you, not as a subordinate, nor as a servant, nor as a mere diplomat, but as a partner, a companion, and a friend who will share your laughter, your burdens, and your discoveries. Hush fell over the assembly. The nobles blinked in unison, a synchronized display of disbelief that seemed to stretch time itself. A few younger officials whispered encouragements, their antennae twitching in admiration of the audacity. A hovering server tripped over its anti-gravity platform in shock. Lyra's own heart thumped, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had spent months observing this human sumer, his courage and his willingness to challenge absurdity with honesty. And now in this audacious, chaotic, utterly human declaration, she recognized the possibility of change, not just for herself, but for the palace, for her world, for the rigid conventions that had dictated the lives of countless generations. Ella's took a step closer, bowing with dramatic flair, nearly tripping on a graviton rail, but recovering with a casual grin. Princess Lyra, he said, voice low, will you accept the risk of partnership with someone entirely unsuited by protocol, but perfectly suited to adventure? He extended his hand, a gesture both formal and playfully human, inviting her into the unknown. Lyra's ears twitched forward, her mind racing through the past weeks, the mishaps in the floating gardens, the laughter they had shared, the absurdity of formal dinners made ridiculous by glittering devices and spilled beverages. She remembered how each joke, each daring act had slowly eroded her cynicism, revealing not chaos but courage, not recklessness but sincerity. She reached out, placing her hand gently atop his, her skin brushing against his, in a connection that transcended etiquette and expectation. I will, she said, her voice calm but radiant, carrying above the nebula and into the ears of the astonished court. not because it is expected, but because it is what I choose, because I see truth, humor, and bravery in a human who would risk everything for what is right. Below, the court erupted into a mixture of stunned silence and awkward applause. Some aliens hovered with mouths agape, unsure how to reconcile tradition with this spectacle of audacity. A few younger nobles cheered, their eyes wide with admiration for the human who had dared to upend centuries of custom. The older officials, after a tense pause, exchanged cautious glances, some grudgingly nodding to acknowledge the courage it took to challenge convention. Ellis grinned, bowing slightly and then straightening, his hand still held by Lyra. Well, that went better than my worst-case scenarios, he muttered. Audible only to her, she laughed, a sound that rippled through the nebula, like a gentle vibration, mixing with the soft hum of the palace and the distant pulse of stars. The following days were a whirlwind of adjustment. Nobles gradually accepted their union, though minor incidents persisted, a graviton chandelier wobbling during their first formal dance, the hover drone accidentally projecting a holographic image of Elias juggling miniature planets, and the court cat asserting dominance over several ceremonial orbs. Yet these mishaps, once a source of stress, now became shared stories, moments of laughter that bridged cultural divides. Lyra discovered that the weight of expectation could be lightened by humor and the willingness to embrace imperfection. Ellis learned that diplomacy, while bewildering, could be navigated with sincerity and audacious honesty. Together they transformed the palace from a place of rigid formality into a stage of possibility and playful rebellion. In private moments, they explored the suspended gardens, danced in zero-gravity chambers, and traced the paths of stars projected in the hallways, finding joy not in perfection but in shared experience. The princess's laughter became more frequent, her ears flicking in delight rather than concern. The human, once an outsider, became a fixture of the palace, a symbol of courage and curiosity that reshaped the perceptions of all who witnessed him. Weeks later, as they stood once more on the observation deck, watching twin moons orbit in serene synchrony, Lyra felt a profound sense of closure. The isolation, the rejection, and the rigid expectations that had once defined her existence had been replaced by partnership, laughter, and trust. Ellis, beside her, reached for a small device that projected a holographic simulation of distant worlds, his grin mischievous. As always, think we'll ever stop causing trouble, he asked. Not likely, she replied, her voice filled with warmth and certainty, and I wouldn't want to. The palace, once a stage for protocol and rejection, now resonated with life, humor, and audacity. Tradition, while respected, no longer dictated the boundaries of possibility. Lyra, the princess once admired yet avoided, had grown into a leader who balanced authority with curiosity, wisdom with playfulness, and strength with openness. Ellis, the human who risked everything with a bold proposal, had not only won her trust but had expanded the horizons of an entire court. Together they face the galaxy not as adversaries of convention, but as companions capable of shaping their destinies with courage, humor, and unshakable sincerity. And as the nebula swirled in living color below the observation deck, casting their shadows across the glimmering surface, Lyra and Ellis stepped forward together, hand in hand, ready to meet the stars. and the adventures beyond with hearts unburdened, spirits unrestrained, and laughter that echoed cross worlds.